introduce myself as a consultant in addition to being a partnership broker. And, my experience has gone from working in the corporate and government sectors to working a lot more with the nonprofit and community sectors over the years and bringing the experience that I've gained through project management and systems implementation work as a management consultant to really focusing on social impact and bringing that experience to communities and addressing poverty and homelessness. And more specifically, I've been really working in the areas of employment-based social enterprise and nonprofit housing over the last over 10 years now to really support individuals who experience systemic barriers, whether it be to having the basics such as housing, to employment, those kind of things. And maybe just as an additional note, by way of introduction, just over the last 2 years, and I don't know if I wear this fully yet, but I have been getting into something called ultra running, and which means running distances longer than a marathon, and which also means running more on trails rather than on roads and cities. And I think there's some parallels around moving from the well-established paved roads and sidewalks of a city to more of the dynamic and unpredictable environment of trails in forests and mountains. So that's a little about me. And I've been an accredited partnership broker through the Partnership Brokers Association since 2015.
The next question is really one of the biggest challenges that community leaders face is this notion of building partnerships that are both authentic and where people, both sides of the partnership, feel engaged. What's your personal approach to partnership building, and how has this informed your work as both a consultant and a facilitator?
One of the things that has really become important to me is a commitment to listening. An acronym that I learned a few years back and it continues to really resonate for me is WAIT, W-A-I-T, and it stands for Why Am I Talking? Now, I realize it's a bit odd that, yes, I am talking because I'm being interviewed for this conversation, but it's really about, as a facilitator, providing the environment and the conditions and the supports for listening to occur, which means providing voice to those who may not have the opportunity through the normal course of things to express what their experience is, what their position is, what's important to them. And I think in partnership brokering, one of the key principles is paying attention to and creating equity in relationships to work together and solving problems that are bigger than any person or bigger than any one organization.
Oh, that's really interesting. So can you give us an example maybe of that notion of enabling voice? So is there one that kind of springs to your mind of a time where it was like really exciting for you?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that builds on a lot of the work that I've seen Tamarack do around giving voice to individuals with lived and living experience. One of the recent initiatives that I was involved in was addressing homelessness in Metro Vancouver, and giving voice meant not only having people who are steeped in knowledge around providing services and support or in the development of policy, but going directly to the individuals within the community that we're serving to hear from them what is their experience of either having experienced homelessness, being at risk of homelessness, and bringing them together in a forum that we set up in just as much a way as we would set up for any other forum, where there's time given for each individual to introduce themselves to a group. There are opportunities for people to express themselves in a way that it's either in front of a plenary session, but also offering different methods. So sometimes, it can be quite intimidating to speak in front of a group of 30 people, and finding different methods to receive their input by smaller conversations, by having them be able to write and provide their thoughts without having to express them verbally. So I think a lot of that's an example of how we deliberately provided voice where it may not historically have been involved in a large scale conversation like addressing homelessness.
That's a great example. So I introduced you as being a certified partnership broker. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Sure. It's above all, for me, what it means, and I'll speak to the benefits before talking about the process, but the benefits of being an accredited partnership broker means that I belong to a network of local, and by local, I mean pan-Canadian and international network of practitioners, people who have asked the same types of questions and experienced the same types of challenges in looking to broker relationships across organizations, across sectors. And, I was doing brokering work before I knew that it actually had a community of people and some degree of label or identity to it. Back in 2005, I had worked for a community economic development organization, and I had this job title of cluster coordinator, which, it's something that would always need explanation, but effectively it was bringing people together across the local business community with the social services agencies, with the levels of government that were involved in this. And so that connection to a network of practitioners who are continually learning together and sharing has been so valuable. Now, in terms of getting the accreditation from a practical standpoint, the Partnership Brokers Association has a 4-day training course, which is then followed by a 4-month period of mentored professional practice, where one's required to provide the written evidence of how you've applied the principles of good partnering, the practices, and then shown that you've reflected back on what you've learned. So that culminates in receiving an accreditation.
It's interesting. I mean, you said at the beginning of your answer that that you felt like you had been doing, a lot of what partnership brokering is all about. And I think that's probably true for many of us that work in this sector or work at a cross community level, that, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes already, there's almost like a checklist. Yeah, that comes into my job, but to understand that there is this kind of network of people that you can also draw in, of colleagues that you can also draw in, is I think really that would be, I think, really helpful.
Yes, I think absolutely. I can imagine the majority of folks on this call have been involved in this work and have done amazing things in the sectors or in the areas, issues that they're looking to address. And so this is about how we can do this even better or more effectively to increase impact in the work that we do.
Yeah. So the Partnership Brokering Association has identified attributes, 10 key attributes that really guide the practice of partnership brokering. And the first one is, it really intrigued me. It's about coming to a shared understanding of what partnership means in the context of the work. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that attribute and how that shows up for you?
Yes, well, Liz, I know that through the work of the Tamarack community and many others, that the word partnership is one of those words that comes up probably every day. And the importance of understanding what we mean by partnerships is something that we want to reinforce. That it can range anywhere from, things that are well established and there's a whole system, and that can create something called a partner where organizations come together to do some work that's already been well established. It can, for some people, mean the structure, as in, there's a legal connotation or legal entity that people can think of when they hear partnership. But more often, when we're talking about social impact, we look at partnerships as the opportunity to drive something transformational or to really do more than what we've done with the status quo or the current system. And so to bring people together at the front end and to say, what do we understand partnership to mean for us has been really important. And in the work that I've done, bringing that up to the forefront has meant really understanding what the nature of the work that we're looking to do together is, i.e., is it to deliver to a specific contract that we're being funded to work together on from let's say, a government agency, or is it more transformational and we're really pushing the edge? What's the nature of the work we're doing together? And what's the nature of our relationship? What are the expectations of how we'll work together? And in that conversation of defining the partnership, that often is something that we will embed into, whether it's a terms of reference or memorandum of understanding, as something that we can continue to refer to keep ourselves true to what we understand our desired relationship to be. And it's something that will shift over time too. So an initial phase of a project might be focused on delivering a specific outcome as per a funded contract, which can give time for us to learn more about each other and what we're trying to achieve together, which can then be a springboard for working together on things that are more transformational in a future phase.
So that's interesting because it kind of sets the rules of the engagement between the parties. And what I heard you say is that it should be co-created.
Absolutely, yes, and that's very much a role of a partnership broker, is to ensure that that opportunity for co-creation is created, is the environment and the processes are designed in a way to allow for and to promote co-creation.
So David, that's one of the principles, but maybe you can walk us through the other partnership brokering key attributes and maybe tell us a little bit about why they matter.
Well, you'll see on the screen there are the first 5, and rather than reading them, I'll just reference a few things that really stand out. Agreement to a shared vision and common purpose. For those who are familiar with collective impact, this is something like common agenda, and this creates the clear anchoring point of why we are working together. But it is balanced by number 3, which is looking at the differences or the unique interests that individual partners have. And I think it's something that I really appreciate about the partnership brokering framework is that it accounts for the fact that, yes, we are coming together for a shared goal. However, we do have our differences in whether it's our mandates or even as individual people, and allowing for that tension to exist and allowing for that tension to exist out in the open. You already mentioned co-creation, and co-creation right from the front end. So before we even get into what it is we're working together, the co-creation of talking about how we will work together, the relationship we'll have. And I point to, I think it was a link to one of the pre-reads that one of my peers, Kathy Gale, had talked about around collective impact, is to talk about the co-creation of the collective, as in how we are together before getting into the impact, the what we will do together. And number 5, commitment to shared risks. So I think that's a fairly standard part of how we view partnerships, is it's not just about benefiting from being in and working together, but it's also understanding we each have contributions to make, which leads to the next set. And number 6, around every partner contributing resources. And I think referencing back to engaging members of a community and understanding that every partner brings resources to the table, which includes things like individuals who share their perspective on lived and living experience. So really broadening resources from the definition of who's bringing the funding or who's bringing the money to the table. It's who has the experience and perspective and who has relationships within a community. Number 7 around decision-making and leadership and mutual horizontal accountability, that's really ensuring that there's attention paid at a more process and tactical level around the governance and decision-making and follow-through on the working together. And having a principled approach, I'm going to park that just for a moment because I think the next slide will show 5 overall principles that I'd like to reinforce around partnering in a good way. And so 10 kind of sums it up in terms of saying, we are not just about delivering specific outcomes. We are paying attention to the way we do that. So the process and relationships, not just delivering outcomes.
Yeah,
oh, sorry, Liz, go ahead.
It's interesting because it's the process and the product, right? So this is really a bias towards the process, but not forgetting that there is a product at the end of it as well.
Absolutely, and there's such an interrelationship between the two. Looking at the process can definitely lead to being more impactful with outcomes, but it also can position the opportunity for outcomes that go beyond a specific project. And, I think a lot of times we come together in partnerships based on very specific opportunities. Maybe there's an opportunity and to go for funding. And so we present together a specific project that we'll work on together. What a partnering lens applies to this is to step back from a specific project and consider what opportunities could go beyond a project, looking at how we can develop that shared understanding of each other.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about these principles, David?
Sure thing, and I'll just reference them quickly. There's a lot of importance to how these principles play out in the nature of a partnership, as well as driving towards the outcomes. And I liked what you said in terms of, yes, we still do need to pay attention to outcomes. It's not only and solely about the relationships we have. The first one that you see is embracing diversity. And I'd like to pair that with the last one, actually, in having courage. The embracing diversity and having courage really come to the forefront when you are looking to have something that is more about transformational change. That, in addition to ensuring equity, is about bringing voice where we haven't had those voices as a part of the bigger conversation historically. And having courage is about pushing into that discomfort where you bring out those tensions where you might have quite initially divergent views and allowing for those to be expressed. Building openness, that's about creating the opportunities for people to get to know each other and to develop the trust. And, I have to say that obviously doesn't happen in a single kickoff meeting. It's something that really builds over time. And there's an approach that can create the stepping stones towards openness and committing to mutual benefit. And so that really ties back to that shared outcome or common agenda. So those are the 5 principles.
Yeah, and they tie really nicely into the attributes for sure. So let's add one more layer to this and let's look at the partnering circle approach. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
When I see this, when I first saw this partnering cycle, it brought to me a degree of comfort, and I'll tell you why. I came from a project management and I mentioned systems implementation background where things are really nicely laid out in project plans and you have an A to Z pathway. And so this partnering cycle gave to me a degree of comfort that there is structure that can be applied to what is often very dynamic work, starting with the scoping and building, and getting to a point where that first phase really acknowledges that there's important work to be done before you even agree to partner with other organizations, and particularly across sectors, before getting into the actual managing and maintaining of the relationships and the work. Review and revising is looking at how have we done, and there's a cyclical nature or an iterative nature to that. And then getting into, well, the bigger question of, if we've delivered it once, how do we sustain this? And how do we look at opportunities to scale? But furthermore, within this cycle is the question of, maybe what we tried isn't the right thing, and maybe we need to move on from this particular partnership. And it really goes into the fact that we might not have, this is more hypothesis testing than it is, this is the solution, and now we've just got to go and replicate and scale. So what this cycle does is it provides some structure, it provides an accompanying set of tools and frameworks that can be applied through the phases of the cycle. And there's a whole 4-day course in going through the cycle in detail and experiencing it directly. So I won't attempt to cover that right now.
Great, but it's interesting because it does provide a little bit of context of how the work unfolds. So I guess my next question is, what are some of the biggest challenges or surprises that you've seen people face when they're trying to build authentic partnerships?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is this idea or the reality of competing interests and opportunities. And sometimes these opportunities or these competing interests, they've been there all along. And in the early stages of a partnership, there wasn't felt to have been enough trust established to share what these competing interests are. And that's, I think, an important role of someone who is brokering or facilitating and building partnerships, is looking at how to provide that opportunity to build the trust and the opportunity so that these things can be shared openly. But other times these things just arise later, and then particularly, in the cycle of governments, moving from one government to another, things can change very quickly, and people can change very quickly. And so, in order to manage that, I think it does take a lot of understanding where people are coming from organizationally, where they are coming from as individuals, and recognizing that, as much as we're bringing people, if we look at a diagram of a partnership, we'll have various organizations represented. To understand there's multiple dimensions. There's the organizations being represented, but there's also the specific people who may have different perspectives within their own organizations that they're having to manage.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting in terms of, and it's dynamic, right? Because you might start a partnership with really committed partners, but if it's a long-term kind of cross-sectoral partnership over time, that might shift, or the demands on their time might shift. And so there's things that really have to be considered in here. I'm sure that we could go on, and maybe some of the folks on the that are listening to the call have some questions around this one that they could probe a little bit more. I have one final question before we open it up to the audience, and please, if you're listening, add your questions in for David. What is it about authentic partnership brokering that has been really the game changer for you and your work? And what advice might you have for the audience as a result of that?
Well, I would reinforce the importance of allowing disagreements to be aired, even in more public forums, and normalizing this as a way to normalizing allowing for the tension and allowing for conversation to happen about those differences. Just one quick story is I remember being a part of a team that convened a session that was primarily bringing together members of the local business community to look at what contribution they could make for community, the downtown east side here in Vancouver. And at the very end of a day-long session, we had a closeout where people shared final thoughts. And as it happened, there was a member of the community who happened to be walking by and looking in through the window, seeing this whole group of people in suits and dressed in business attire, who was curious about it and came in. And he was a member of the Anti-Poverty Coalition. And I remember the lead facilitator allowing him to speak. And as someone who was on the team, my heart dropped. And I was wondering, what is this individual going to say? This is going to take us off track. This is not the way we want to end the day. Well, this person spoke from the heart in terms of, the experience of poverty as a member of this community, which was such a different tone and topic from the rest of the day, which had been about potential business initiatives in the community. And that really stood out for people in terms of getting such a deeper firsthand experience about what they were engaging in. And so allowing for that different perspective, as divergent as it might feel at the time, I feel has been something that really adds the necessary understanding for people who are coming together to work together, especially from different sectors.
Well, thanks so much, David. So now we're going to open it up to the question and answer part of the call. And so we encourage you, those of you that are listening, to send us your questions and comments through the question box on the control panel. And we'll do our best to get to all of them. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Duncan, who you heard from at the very beginning of the call, to raise some of the questions that you've already seen come up in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thanks to everyone who's already submitted your questions. If you haven't quite yet, feel free to use the Q&A panel or the chat panel just to send in your thoughts and questions. The first question comes from Dina, and they ask, how do you handle different power dynamics within the team, whether financial, hierarchical, personality differences, etc.?
That's a great question in terms of the power dynamics. And I think the power dynamics exist organizationally and individually. Some examples that come to mind is oftentimes the power dynamics can be skewed towards, let's say, larger government funders because of the fact that they bring the monetary resources. And so the role that I have played as a broker has been to absolutely acknowledge and appreciate that, and then to broaden the conversation to talk about what else is important in terms of both better understanding of the issue at hand or the opportunity at hand, and the other valuable resources that come into this, such as relationships with the community. So I see that as a really important way of structuring the conversation, is to make sure that, yes, acknowledging where some of the historic power might come from, and having that open conversation about how people perceive that difference in power. What I would also say is, outside of group sessions, there is an opportunity, and this is a lot of the work of a broker, is to meet with stakeholders individually. And it's almost, there are different hats that a broker can wear, and I don't want to simply call it coaching, but there's a coaching element to it, which is to hear from each stakeholder and to ask them what they think is important for them to share with the other partners, and ask them what they believe might be standing in the way of them sharing that. And taking that information into account is then looking at, well, how could I design a process or create the opportunity for a conversation which addresses those barriers?
That's great. Thank you so much, David. We have a quick question from Bev, and they ask, is a partnership broker similar to a boundary spanner?
This is one of the things that I think is particularly challenging, is there is no distinct title or kind of universal identity that can be put into words. So, for example, we have globally, there's the Project Management Institute, and people can be project managers, and there's a degree of understanding of what a project manager does. For a partnership broker, I really like the title of boundary spanner. There is absolutely work that is done around looking at creating those relationships and bridges that span currently existing boundaries. And so I think that could very well be a title that fits very well with a lot of what a partnership broker does, particularly if we're talking about transformational type work.
I think if I were to add in here, David and Duncan, is that from what I've heard David say today, that it is someone who pays attention to the brokering process and the product, right? So there could be on any kind of given table multiple partnership brokers, or there could be one person who says, I'm going to take on the role of really making sure that we have a good process in place, that we have good conversation about what the partnership is all about, and kind of the other elements of it and the process we might go through, and then also use that as not only moving towards the product, but also thinking about the opportunity for transformation as well. So I think that's what I heard today, David. I wonder if you might either say I'm right or correct me if I'm wrong.
I really like what you've said there, Liz. I think there's this notion of, we have people who might have particular role titles, whether it be within an organization or within, let's say, a multi-stakeholder partnership. And the idea that there's one person who does the partnership brokering or has that role, I think is one that we need to really push on. And in fact, they can be the ones who really are the champions and advocates for paying attention to the process. But in fact, where things really take hold is when partnering, it moves away from a title or a noun to a verb, where everyone has that partnering lens and can take that back within their organization. So there's a collective accountability for partnering. It doesn't just fall on a person who might be given this title of broker or boundary spanner. It's something that everyone adopts as a part of the partnering team, knowing that there's work to be done outside of people that come together for a particular partnership and or project. And that work goes into their organizations and understanding the nature and the diversity and challenges of the relationships within each organization.
Nice.
That's great. Thank you both for your thoughts there. The next question comes from Roslyn. They ask, do you recommend including a conflict resolution mechanism in any memorandum of understanding from the outset to help address issues and diffuse tensions as they arise?
I think this is always a good thing to pay attention to. Sometimes the words can be potentially triggering, or it's kind of the same reaction that people might have to a prenuptial agreement, is to say, well, haven't we agreed that we are going to be in it together, that we will work together? So to assume conflict or that, but I think the way it's introduced can be paying attention to the way it's introduced, it is important to acknowledge the fact that there will be conflict, there will be tension. So that's a great suggestion, and having that as a part of an upfront MOU in terms of reference, also important. What I would also say is it is important not to simply create these documents and then assume that they are set. So two things is, they're a constant point of reference, and that degree of aliveness these documents have, if they're written in a way that people feel comfortable referring to and feel really reflects the co-created set of principles and how we'll work together, I think that's a real signal as to how well that work's been done. And then, reflecting at points in time to say, is this still working for where we are at now? So the definition of something that happened at the outset, then you go through a phase together. You might want to revisit and just check in and say, do these things still hold true for where we are now?
Thank you so much for that. Our next question comes from Kulan. Say, how do you engage in community partnerships with people who have become disillusioned and critical of the status quo?
That is certainly a challenge. I think, and I don't say I'll subscribe to Jeffrey Sachs's notions of economic development and such, but I believe it's a quote, at least I keep attributing it to him, is that he was saying that, the biggest barrier to addressing poverty is cynicism. And, I think the opportunity and the role of someone who creates the forums and the sessions and of partners coming together is to reflect back what you see. And if there's burnout, if there's cynicism, if there are these things standing in the way of the work, is to call it out. And I think reflecting that back, a facilitator or broker as a mirror is as valuable a role as one can play, because when people are seeing that reflection back in a very unfiltered way, it allows them the opportunity to respond to it. And I think there's more power, rather than suggesting what is done about it, is to ensure that people see that full reflection back, and with the group of partners, identify what will they do to change from that.
And would it be sometimes, David, just building on that, would it be sometimes that you just, the group might say, look, the timing, given the context that we're in right now, the timing for this work might not be right because of, the tension or what might have happened in the past. So when you go to the agreement on a shared vision and common purpose, and you're getting a sense that, we can't agree, or people are feeling overwhelmed, or, whatever that is that they bring, that at some point it's better to walk away than to pursue something that might not work.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think as much as the partnering has become such an important consideration and something that people have taken on to address challenges, to take on opportunities, I think it's important to note that sometimes partnering isn't right for a given set of stakeholders or for a given time, and is to be upfront about that, and to then create a process where people can step away from a partnership. Sometimes it is simply taking a break and saying, this isn't the time, just given whatever else is happening. There might be other really urgent priorities. And So creating that, having that really open and honest conversation about that, creating a clear process where people can step away, so there's not this kind of purgatory or vagueness around, are we in this partnership or are we not? And having some definitive to it, which can also mean that, you know, the commitment could be we're stepping away from the partnership, but we also commit to come back in 6 months' time and talk about the opportunity of where we could once again partner.
That's great, and I really appreciate that insight into the idea that the idea not to move forward with a partnership is still a valid option. That's really helpful to provide some context. Our next question comes from Heather, but has been echoed by a large number of people. Lots of us want to know a bit more about that 4-day course on the partnering cycle specifically, and if you could provide a bit more information about that and the process that you go through.
Absolutely. There, in fact, is a course in Toronto the week of February 3rd to 6th, being held at Ryerson University. I can make sure that there are details made available to you, Duncan, that could be made available to everyone on this call. And further to that, what I would say is this course is available at cities worldwide, and there's a link that people can go to on the Partnership Brokers website, which shows where those courses are being held.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'll make sure that that link is included in the post-webinar email that'll go out tomorrow. So anyone who's curious about that course can look for that information. We have time for just a few more questions here. The next is from Cassandra. So thank you, David. Did you use any creative methods to get information from any of the groups you've worked with? For example, if you're working with people that have a low literacy rate or language barriers, using pictographs or voting to prioritize ideas, etc.
There are just a number of methods around how to engage people in group settings, and I really like the fact that you've mentioned considerations of things that we might take for granted, such as literacy of participants and such. I would say that one of the things I like to make as a consistent way of getting input and engaging people is multiple methods within sessions if we're bringing people together. So whether there's, there's always opportunity for individuals to write their feedback, to share verbally, to share in small groups, in pairs, small groups, and plenary, and using multiple methods. And the one thing that I consistently try and include is the offer of people being able to offer their input on a post-it note, which can be handed in without identifying, without having to provide their name, as a way for them to provide input. I think there's a a whole world out there of different facilitative techniques. So I won't say I'm an expert across those, but I like the question very much, because I think it's thinking about who are we looking to engage and what would create more equity in terms of them being able to contribute their input.
Just building on that, I love using art as part of a facilitation process, right? Getting people to draw together and to conceptualize together. And I think that's something that we don't do that often. And it does enable creativity in different kinds of ways. Sometimes people are afraid. And so it usually takes them a little bit longer to get, to pick up the colored pens. But if you give them enough time, you get some really, really innovative and creative approaches to, thinking through an idea collectively together. So I love the pictograph approach as well. But I've also seen a number of pictures being posted around the room and having people, go to those pictures and then talk about how they understand that picture or how they interpret that picture. And that leads to kind of really interesting conversations as well, that it's less about me and more about what this collectively represents for us as a group. So there's a couple of other kinds of tools that you can bring into the work as well.
That's great. I think we have time to tackle two more questions. The first comes from Gregory. How do you handle simple miscommunication within discussion? People just not understanding each other's words or intentions? And whose responsibility would it be to clarify positions during a discussion? And what's your methodology for this?
Great question. The first thought that comes to mind is the word shared accountability. So yes, there is a role for someone who is brokering a partner and having that as their specific focus to ensure that there's opportunities for understanding or for any misunderstandings to be aired and to be clarified. And the goal is that through the course of time of the relationship building, that there's increased accountability on each individual taking that upon themselves, where first of all, feeling open and safe enough to be able to say, I don't understand, or that didn't quite resonate with me. And second of all, to know that they can come back and clarify. And I think one of the things that really stands out is there can be a lot of pressure, especially with time constraints, that you have people together for, let's say it's a half day or a day, and maybe you only have people coming together once a month, just given schedules, et cetera. And so there's a lot of pressure to make sure that that there's a shared level of understanding achieved within that one day. And I like to step back and ensure that there are ways to embed communication in between those sessions, that people can clarify and develop their relationships outside of those formally convened sessions. And I think that's where, so that not all the eggs are in the basket of all understanding must be achieved in this session, that there are other ways. And this is where a lot of my work in supporting partnerships is out, not only in facilitating sessions like that, but also outside and checking back in with stakeholders after a session. And sometimes things only come 24 hours after. You sleep on it, you wake up and you go, okay, now I can articulate what didn't quite sit or didn't quite resonate. And as the broker receiving that information from the one-on-ones is then seeking to either promote someone being able to share that with their group, or maybe it's just with one other partner they need to do that with, or to look at how to incorporate that into the next opportunity to bring people together. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. We have time just for one quick answer to a final question. It comes from Michael. And they say, you briefly covered the evaluation portion of the cycle. Do you have any tools that are used to complete the evaluation of a partnership or the results of the same partnership?
Short answer is yes, absolutely there are tools. And those tools ensure that there's attention paid not only to are the outcomes of a partnership, how are they being achieved, but the relationship between the partners and across the partners. And those can be referenced through the partnership broker's website. That's my short answer.
Thanks so much, David. So that's all the time that we have, as Duncan has said. We want to thank everyone who joined us on the call today and really acknowledge the great questions. They were very provocative, and I think they gave us some food for thought in terms of the things that you're all struggling with and the things that, at Tamarack we've struggled with as well in terms of creating effective partnerships and effective processes. I'd also like to thank David for his wisdom, his experience, and your openness, David, to share some of the challenges that you faced in this work, but also some of the things that you've navigated in terms of your experiences as a partnership broker. Before we go, I just want to throw it over to my colleague again, Duncan, for a few quick announcements before we wrap up this call. So over to you, Duncan.
Thanks again, Liz. And thanks, David, for joining us. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, everyone will receive an email tomorrow as a follow-up with a full recording of today's conversation, a copy of the slides, as well as a collection of links and resources. I'll be sure to include a link to the information about that 4-day workshop because lots of people were interested in that. On top of that, the Tamarack Institute does have a few learning opportunities that are coming up quickly, specifically in the Toronto area. The first is taking place on January 29th, and it's Collaborative Innovation, Leading Multi-Stakeholder Collaboration. This is a single-day event being presented with our friends at Co-Creative, and it's designed to build your capacity to lead multi-stakeholder collaborations to help groups connect, align, learn, and make what they need to advance their work effectively. I think that's a direct tie-in with the conversation we've had today. So if you're interested in learning more, you can follow the link on your screen. We'll also include the link in the follow-up email. The second learning opportunity is co-design, facilitating community-led innovation. This is taking place March 4th to 5th in Toronto again, and it's a 2-day workshop designed to give you hands-on experience and a step-by-step approach to designing and facilitating collaborative community innovation sessions. That's a new event from us at the Tamarack Institute, and we're really excited to bring it to Toronto. So if you're interested in community innovation, we encourage you to check that out. Thanks again to everyone for joining us on today's call and for your amazing questions and comments. And thanks again to David for joining us. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.